out of the way, let's get to our first session this morning. It's going to be the post-pandemic built environment presented by Tom Fisher. So like Greg, I initially heard Tom speak on this conference, on this topic at a conference last November in what we now know were the early stages of the pandemic. So I'm looking forward to hearing the latest effects on the built environment. Tom is a professor in the School of Architecture, director of the Minnesota Design Center, and a former dean of the College of Design at the University of Minnesota. The former editorial director of Progressive Architecture magazine, he was recognized in 2005 as the 5th most published architecture writer in the United States. He has written or edited 11 books, 70 chapter books or introductions, and over 450 articles in professional journals and major publications. His research has focused on urban design, strategic design, and human-centered design, as well as on ethics and the built environment. Tom, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Stacy, and welcome everybody. I'm going to share my screen, and I will give my remarks, and then I hope we have a really active and engaging Q&A section afterward. So let me just move to the share screen mode here, and let me see if I can do full view here. Okay. So I want to talk about the impact that the pandemic is having on the built environment. And this is a topic that has long interested me. I've actually written about this topic for a number of years, and I just want to make sure. Oh, there we go. That wasn't quite what I had in mind here. Here, let me end this show because I think it's showing all of the presenters. Let me not do the presenter view, but let me see if I can do the slideshow. All right. So I've been interested in the impact of pandemics for a long time. I wrote the first article on the impact of pandemics back in 2010, and an article in the journal Places called Viral Cities. And at the time, I never thought that I or any of us would live through a pandemic. Pandemics typically happen every 80 to 100 years. But of course, we've all now lived through one and are in many ways still in the midst of one. And so I thought that some of the lessons from past pandemics would be useful as a way to kind of understand what in fact might happen and what we might expect to happen going forward. So as Stacy said, I am not only a professor in a School of Architecture, but I direct a research center that looks at the ways in which the built environment is changing and the ways that large systems are functioning or not functioning very well. And so we've actually been involved in a year-long effort to try to understand the post-pandemic world at my center. We've done a series of workshops. I've been part of a podcast on this topic. I started writing a blog as soon as the pandemic began. And then I have completed recently a book that for Routledge, which will be published in early May of next year. And so,
Tom,
yeah.
Your camera doesn't appear to be working.
Oh, okay.
I think we've got you frozen, and we just see the screen that you're presenting with subtitles.
Oh, all right. Okay. So I wonder, well, here, let me maybe stop sharing the screen. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
You can hear me, but you don't see the slides.
Well, right now, I don't see the slides, and the picture of you is frozen.
Okay. Well, so it sounds like, that's odd. I don't know what happened there. It, so, so Zoom is obviously working because you can hear me,
Right.
but I'm not quite sure why I'm frozen.
Let's see if you, can you like unshare your screen, and then let's see if we get you back.
Yeah. Okay. Let me, all right. Let me do that. Huh. All right. I've got, it's an odd thing. I've got two screens up and it's not letting, here, let me do this. Okay, sorry. I had two displays up and maybe that was the problem. So let me try this again. How is that? Is that better?
Yeah, we see your slides. You are still frozen. So we're not actually seeing you speaking, but we do see the slides.
Okay. Well, you don't need to see me as long as the slides are moving.
Okay.
Are the slides changing?
Yes.
Okay. Well, as long as you can hear me and see the slides, you certainly don't need to see me. So
Okay. We'll just see you then during questions.
yeah,
Okay.
I'll stop sharing my screen and we can do that. So, so as I was saying, we've been involved in looking at the impact of the pandemic on the built environment. And this was, again, part of the workshops that we did. This is a tentative view of the cover of the book that Routledge will be publishing on the post-pandemic world. And you know, what I want to talk about today is the enormous impacts that pandemics have on the built environment. And I think we in our fields tend to forget this. This isn't often taught very much in schools of architecture or in interior design. And I want to make the case that these events are some of the most dramatic in terms of the long-term impact on the built environment. So in the book, for example, I talk about the 19th century cholera pandemics. There were actually a series of pandemics that made their way across the world in the early to mid 19th century. And this completely changed our view of cities. So cholera, as you may know, is a bacterial infection carried through contaminated water. And in fact, the recognition of the cholera bacteria by a doctor in London, John Snow, discovering that it was being carried through the population through a contaminated well on the Broad Street pump, was really actually the beginning of the public health field, where prior to that, people thought that we got ill by breathing bad air. It was this miasma theory of disease, which was never really carefully studied. And it was Dr. Snow who recognized that it's actually bacteria in water that was killing people. And so what that led to, for example, in the latter part of the 19th century was the requirement that there be indoor plumbing in buildings, that there be sanitary sewers, that we have water treatment plants, and that we would establish water utilities in cities. And the impact that this had was also a change in the way in which we saw cities. Prior to the cholera pandemic, we tended to see and treat cities as if they were just large villages. And so more and more people were coming into cities, but we still had outhouses and latrines, and people were still throwing contaminated water out onto the street. And it was after the cholera pandemic that we recognized that cities are somehow different from a village, that a city is a different phenomenon. It's a different kind of environment that requires a different kind of infrastructure than what somebody could have out in a rural area. And that really, all of those changes really enabled the growth of the industrial city. So while we tend to study in our fields the rise of the elevator and of steel and concrete construction that led to the high rise, all of those things were obviously also important. It was actually the change in the way we saw water infrastructure as enabling us to live close together in a healthier way. And so a couple points here. One, the cholera pandemics ended, but the impact of the cholera pandemic extended for decades, and in many ways, obviously still affects us. We still deal with water issues. Nevada obviously is very concerned about water and the health of its water system. And so, so one point here is that pandemics trigger things. Pandemics also have this effect of greatly accelerating us into the future. And this will be, I think, relevant as we talk about the current pandemic and where it has taken us. But many of these technologies in the 19th century were known prior to the pandemic. I mean, we knew about indoor plumbing and we knew about sanitary sewers, but it took the pandemic of cholera to accelerate us into widespread adoption of those technologies and the transformative effect then that they had on the built environment. A similar thing actually happened in the 1918 flu pandemic, which, like COVID-19, was a viral pandemic. And this was the first time that we talked about wearing masks. We're concerned about social distancing. And that also had an enormous impact on the built environment. Because what happened is that the 1918 flu accelerated us into essentially a suburban model of the built environment. Is that we had, for example, automobiles prior to 1918, but the automobile prior to that pandemic was largely seen as a kind of a plaything of wealthy people. It wasn't as widely used technology as became the case after the 1918 flu, in that people actually wanted to social distance in their transportation. They wanted to have a private automobile and to be able to travel apart from others rather than taking, say, the trolley. And so we started to see this shift from a kind of transit-based transportation system to an automobile-based system. But the same thing actually happened in housing. So just as the cholera pandemic had encouraged people and enabled people to live closer together, the 1918 flu encouraged and prompted people to want to live further apart. And so there was a widespread interest in single-family housing. And there were interesting impacts that the pandemic had. So, for example, in many zoning codes, there's a 6-foot side yard setback between your house and and the property line. That came right out of the 6-foot social distancing recommendations from the 1918 flu. And so you can begin to see that these pandemics have long-term effects, kind of social, psychological effects on us in terms of how far apart we wanted to stay from each other. And they also, there are policies that then emerge so that, for example, obviously there was single family housing prior to the 1918 flu, but a lot of the mortgage policies of banks prior to 1918 called for that if you wanted to buy a house, you had to put 50% down, and there was typically a 5-year mortgage. And so with those kinds of constraints, obviously, there were a lot of people who could not afford to own a single family house. What happened after the 1918 flu is that banking and mortgage policy started to change. They eventually, in the 1920s and then finally through the early 1930s, we developed the modern mortgage system that we now have, with, say 20% down and 30-year mortgages, which enabled many more people to own housing than was possible before. So again, you see how a pandemic accelerated us, took things that existed prior to the pandemic, and then accelerated us rapidly into the future. And so with that kind of historical lesson in mind, I want to talk about what we might anticipate with COVID-19, because I think that the acceleration that has happened now with this pandemic is this idea of rebalancing the digital and the physical world. And of course, we all know this, right? I mean, look at what we're doing right now. We're having a webinar that is, digitally enabled. And of course, we had all of this technology prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. We had the internet, we had Zoom, we had mobile digital devices. We had distance learning, we had telecommuting, we had telehealth, we had online shopping, all of these things, and yet they were still viewed in a somewhat marginal way. Basically, we had all of the technology available to us, just as in the 19th century they had plumbing technology. It simply wasn't widely used. And so in our current time, we've had all this technology, but we still, prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, had a 20th century mindset, which was that we assumed that to go to work, we had to go to an office. To shop, we had to go to a store. To learn, we had to go to the school. To have a doctor's appointment, we had to go to the clinic or the doctor's office. And what this pandemic showed is we don't have to do any of that. And that is a profound shift in human culture. For the first time in human history, the physical world now is in competition with the digital world for virtually every human activity. Almost everything. Obviously, there's some things you still have to do in person. If you're having surgery, you still have to go physically to a place, right? If you're in certain industries, the meat processing industry, you still have to go to the meat processing plant, right? So it's not as if this shift affects every aspect of human activity. But what COVID-19 showed is that we can have a lot of the world, a lot of the goods and services that we need delivered to our doorstep. And so for those of us who are involved in the built environment, this is one of the most transformative events, probably in a very long time, perhaps even in the entire history of our building the physical world, which is now that we have this complementary and also competitive digital world that can, in fact, in many ways outperform what the physical world does. So as I want to now go through a series of building types, and then I'm going to also end my talk with thinking about the urban scale implications of this. And I'll show some data points and then talk about how this transformation may affect many of the building types that we now assume to be necessary. And by the way, I think what's also interesting about this, I talk about this in the book, is that our professions actually emerged, say schools of architecture in the 19th century, interior design programs in the 20th century, largely because of this assumption that the world needed a set of specialized building types to accommodate diverse human activities. And so our cities have organized around that. Our professions are based on that. We define often our firms in terms of the markets that we work in. And we have a lot of specialized knowledge about these specialized building types. I think what has been profound about COVID-19 and the current pandemic is this idea that almost all of this human activity has occurred out of people's houses. And so it is in many ways challenged the very premise upon which our fields are based, which is that every human activity requires a specialized building, and that our lives are organized around commuting from a home to an office, to a place of learning, to a place of recreation, and back again. Because 2/3 of the American economy now comes out of people's homes. And more than half of all the businesses in the country are now based in people's homes. And so, and the last time that that occurred was in the early 19th century, when people lived on farms and lived in homesteads. So one of the ways to think about what we have just gone through is that it is in many ways a kind of high-tech, digital-enabled version of an earlier way in which people used to live, which is instead of commuting to, a specialized building, a school, an office, a place of a shopping mall, what have you, is that we can do all of those activities without ever leaving the homestead. And so thinking about the impact that's going to have not only on the home and residential design, but also on all of the other building types that we've developed, which assume that people need to come there, is a remarkable change. And I also want to make the case before I continue that there's a strong tendency in pandemics to want to go back to the way it was. And this happened in the 19th century. It happened after the 1918 flu. And that's completely understandable. First of all, pandemics don't last very long. They're usually a couple years in length. And so we all remember what it used to be like in 2019, and there's a strong desire to go back to the way it was in 2019. But one of the lessons of pandemics is there's no going back, that they literally transform the world that we live in because they've rapidly accelerated us into a future that we thought was going to happen incrementally. And it quite literally happened in a matter of weeks. And so I think one of the mistaken tendencies is to think that everything will just go back because it never does and it won't. And so maybe with that, I will start, let me just start looking at some of the impacts that this may have on various kinds of built environments. So let's look at the office. We are going to have a lot of this. There is going to be a tremendous amount of excess office space in the coming years. We don't see it yet because obviously there are a lot of leases, long-term leases that people have with their offices. And so the built environment is a kind of lagging indicator of change, but it is a big mistake to think that somehow, well, all the offices are full, everyone will just come back and we'll go back to the way it was. That is not going to happen because what is already starting to happen is that companies, consultants, businesses are starting to say, why do I need all of this space? I still need an office, but what kind of office do I need and how much office do I need? And we're already seeing it here in the Twin Cities, for example. Target, one of our large corporations, has several office buildings downtown. They've already announced that they're abandoning a 50-story office building. They're consolidating their headquarters into some of their other towers. And there's an entire 50-story office building that will soon be empty. And we're going to start to see that happening in city after city. And the reason this is happening is, as I said, 2/3 of the US economy is now coming out of people's homes. 42% of the workforce is now working full-time. They don't even plan to go back to an office. And we're seeing this particularly in certain kinds of activities. My center does work down at the Mayo Clinic, and the Mayo Clinic has decided that all of its tech, its IT people, its HR people, its accounting people, all of those staff will permanently be working at home from now on. They have no intention of bringing some of those activities back into the office. We're also seeing this with many of our global corporations here, Medtronic, the big medical device company here, General Mills, the big food company. They're realizing that a lot of their people have been working remotely anyway, even prior to the pandemic. And so they're just institutionalizing that, saying that you no longer need to come to the office unless there's a reason. And I'll get to those reasons in a minute. But I think this is also an important data point, which is in a recent survey of employers, 91% think that their staffs are more productive working from home. So this isn't simply that workers want the flexibility to be able to work at home, but their employers agree with them. And so this is why we're going to see a dramatic shift in the idea of the office and the role of the office, how much office space we're going to need. Because when you get both employee and employer thinking that there's a better way of doing something, this is when change occurs. And again, these are not just short term. There's this recent survey that 75% of employees want to continue to work at least 1 or more days a week from home, with 32% wanting to work from home even after the pandemic is done full time. And there's also some really interesting generational differences here. I mean, and they don't always agree. There's one survey that was done that showed that, in fact, an older workforce is the one that prefers to work more at home, and that younger employees are more eager to go back to the office because they're concerned about not having mentoring opportunities. Younger people tend to get more of their social connections in the office. And so there's some surveys that suggest younger people might be more eager to go in the office, more older employees less so. But I've also seen other surveys that show that younger people are also more comfortable working remotely because of the technology and their comfort with technology. And so again, it's really hard to know how these pandemics will sort of pan out and what the long-term effects will be, but there is no question that these data points suggest that we are in for a very different future in terms of work. And I think we're going to start to see this rise of what are so-called digital nomads, people who are deciding that, well, I can really work anywhere, so I'm going to go to a place that I want to be in. I'm going to go to an environment. So we're starting to see, for example, the rise of so-called Zoom towns, which are more remote locations that, as long as they have high bandwidth connection to the internet, are attracting a lot of people who formerly lived in cities and suburbs and commuted to the office every day. And so this idea of digital nomadicism is going to also, I think, have an impact on the urban-rural divide that this country has been struggling with. Because I think we're going to, and we already are starting to see many urbanites moving into rural areas permanently and continuing to work remotely. And so that's going to change the politics in this country. I think it's also bringing some real stresses on smaller communities. I have colleagues, architects who had offices in New York City. They've moved permanently to their cabins in Connecticut or Western Massachusetts or upstate New York, and into towns that are concerned about traffic and being able to accommodate so many new residents all at once. And so pandemics do bring a lot of disruption that is good and bad. I think we're also going to see a lot more of what's on the right here, which is the office is going to have to become more home-like. So just as the home is going to have more of an office character and more of an office-like function as people work from home, the workplace is going to have to compete. And so it's going to have more comfortable furniture, better lighting, a greater variety of places to work, spaces that might be more living room-like or dining room-like or cafe-like. And again, we've seen these trends. These are not necessarily new trends, but they were not as dominant as I think they will be. I also think it's probably the case that the idea of the office cubicle farm is probably over. That in many cases, and I think most employers are realizing that there is no need for people to commute 9 to 5 to sit in a cubicle and to work on their computer by themselves. They're much more productive if they did that at home or some other place, but not necessarily in expensive real estate in the office. And so I think the office is going to play a different kind of role. It's going to be the place where we go to collaborate, to get access to technology that perhaps we don't have access to at home, to work on team projects, but I think we're going to see a division where work that you're working on by yourself, on a computer digitally, that will probably increasingly not be done necessarily in the office unless you so choose to go there. And so again, the idea of hoteling in offices, which again is something that has occurred in the past, I think is going to become a kind of dominant mode. There's probably going to be much less of sort of personal offices that are yours and that sit empty, most of the time. I think that, employers are going to start to say, wait a minute, not only was the corner office empty before, now it's empty most of the time. That's a waste of space. And so, again, this is in one way is, one can see as a kind of threat to our world, but in another way, there's a tremendous amount of work that is to be done in helping reimagine these kinds of spaces. And so I have no doubt that our fields will have plenty to do, because even in the process of shrinking the square footage of an office and reimagining an office is a lot of work. I think the ones who probably should be concerned about this trend are the office building owners, because I think owners are going to find that they're going to need to reimagine what happens in their buildings. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. But we may, in fact, also need to stop using certain terms. For example, maybe we stop calling them office buildings, because I suspect they're going to be buildings in which there will be people working, people living, people making things, and a whole wide range of other kinds of activities that building owners will need to embrace in order to fill their space. So let's look at retail. We're also going to have a lot of this. And again, this is not a new phenomenon. We've been seeing shrinkage of, big box retail, for example, now for quite a while. But what has happened with the pandemic is it accelerated that trend, as pandemics tend to do. And we already were way, way overbuilt in terms of retail, as data points like this show, 10 times the number of stores per capita, vastly more square footage per capita than any other developed country. And so, one of the things that pandemics also do is that they reveal inefficiencies in systems. They also reveal inequities, and I'll get to that as well. But they reveal the dysfunctions that existed that we sort of overlooked prior to the pandemic. And retail is going to definitely go through this fairly dramatic shift in the amount of retail space that we need and what goes on in the retail space that we have. There's also, I think, this challenge, which is this pandemic has really stressed small businesses. And one of the concerns I hear being discussed among mayors is they don't want their cities to be left with just a city entirely of national chains, with all of the small businesses now out of business. And so thinking about how do we support small businesses is, I think, going to be one of the challenges that we're going to have going forward in cities. And I think one of the other things that has been interesting about this pandemic, as in past ones, is again, while often the technologies existed prior to the pandemic, the embrace of it was still rather narrow. And I think what's interesting are data points like this, which is that many people who never did online grocery shopping plan to continue to do so after the pandemic. They realize that there are some real advantages to online shopping. And so pandemics tend to convert people. They tend to move many more people into this kind of new world. And so, obviously we're going to see the store come home. The store is going to be what gets delivered to the home. But we're also seeing this kind of interesting phenomenon, which is then the questioning of what do we do in bricks and mortar retail? And this idea that, again, this is where the physical world has to compete with the digital world by thinking about what the physical world can do that the digital world cannot. So this idea of having immersive experiences, having memorable events. And again, in your state, in cities like Las Vegas and Reno, you're excellent in creating immersive experiences indoors in casinos and other places. And so there's probably much that the national design community could learn from your experiences. But and this is an image from IKEA that is starting to have breakfast in bed events, sleepovers. They're basically experimenting with the idea that you just don't go to a showroom to look at the furniture, but you use it. You sort of try it out. And so some of these things I think we're going to see a lot of experimentation as retailers reimagine their bricks and mortar. And we're also going to see a lot of hybridization. This is another phenomenon that is true of virtually every pandemic, is that we tend to take a little bit of the past and mix it with a little bit of the future into new kinds of hybrids. So again, the retailer up here, Target, has actually did pretty well during the pandemic because they reimagined what business they were in, because obviously Target was competing with Amazon, which has become the 800-pound gorilla in the online shopping world, right? But what Target did is to say, no, we're not a retailer. What we are is a curator and a distributor of goods. And so once they began to redefine themselves in that way, they realized that, wait a minute, our stores have to be these experiences that are memorable for people. And they also turned all of their stores into distribution centers and were able to compete with Amazon because Target had a widely distributed distribution system, while Target had tended to go toward a more centralized distribution system with larger facilities. And it turned out that having a distribution center in many neighborhoods was a better way to go. People could, drive and have it, pick up their goods right in the parking lot, something you can't necessarily do with Amazon. And so, again, one of the points here is, and I make this in the book repeatedly, is that pandemics are opportunities for great entrepreneurial invention. And the businesses that understand the nature of a pandemic's effect and that are open to experimentation and redefining what their business is and will often thrive after pandemics. Another data point here is that there's typically an economic boom after a pandemic. There's a lot of pent-up demand that is unleashed. I mean, look at what happened in the Roaring '20s after the 1918 flu, or after the cholera pandemics and the end of the Civil War, the boom in the United States in the 1870s and 80s. And so we are likely to see that. There's other economic analyses that show that wages tend to go up because there's a demand for labor, and we're already seeing that. Employers are having to pay people more because they can't find enough workers, so wages go up. And interestingly enough, that while there is short-term inflation, such as the one that we are incurring now because of bottlenecks in systems and delivery systems, that interest rates tend to stay low for quite a while after pandemic. And so one reason there tends to be this economic boom is that wages are up, interest rates are low, and there's a lot of pent-up demand. So let me just move on here. Let's look at malls, another area where, obviously there's been a lot of closures that were occurring prior to the pandemic. 25% of our roughly 1,000 malls are going to close in the next few years. Pandemic, again, just tends to accelerate something that was already underway. We've also seen the fate of major department stores. Again, a trend that was occurring prior to COVID-19, but one that COVID-19 sort of accelerated. It's as if pandemics push us to tipping points, that there are trends that are mounting. And what the pandemic does is sort of push it over the edge. And so I think, again, we're going to see a lot of these bricks and mortar stores really struggle. And interestingly enough, the department store as a building type was one of the innovations that occurred after the cholera pandemics. In other words, as cities had the kind of infrastructure they needed for people to live in denser settings, people started to demand the department store as a kind of one-stop shopping place that you could go to a department store and get everything that you might want. And so interestingly enough, what one pandemic gave rise to, another pandemic is probably going to kill, or at least greatly shrink in terms of its footprint. And, I think we're also going to have to start to think about what are we going to do with all of this excess space. So even as we're seeing, excess office space, excess retail space, we continue to have the demand for housing. And I think we're going to start to see not only more closures, but more creative uses of these excess malls. Here's an image on the right from Providence, Rhode Island, one of the early, actually a 19th century mall there that has been converted into affordable housing, micro unit housing. And so again, there's lots of opportunities for the design professions to work with owners to creatively reimagine their space. And again, to help them think about the fact that they may have thought about it as retail space, but in the end, it's just space. And what are the many different uses that a given space can have, and how can we reimagine and reinterpret the built environment? So I also think, as I talk to my students here, there's a lot of creativity in this, that we may be actually building fewer new buildings, and that a lot of the practice, a lot of the work going forward is going to be the creative adaptation of a lot of the excess built space that we already have. Affordable housing, huge need. The paradox that we're going to have in one city after another is, the problem of homelessness in the shadow of half-empty office buildings. And again, thinking about how we can turn these kinds of inequities into opportunities, I think is an opportunity. Obviously there are many people who have struggled with the pandemic, and we may face continued homelessness in cities because of evictions. And there are some statistics that suggest we might go from roughly 500,000 Americans who are typically homeless on any given night to perhaps over 2 million. And so again, looking at how we can take the deficit in affordable housing and connect it to the excess space that we have, I think is going to be one of the opportunities, especially given this need of, over 7 million units are needed in the country right now. So, and so I think that we'll start to see these kinds of reimagination efforts underway, where there will be new kinds of co-housing. We've in my center been looking at, how do you take, say, the floor of a typical office and convert it to housing? And there's some challenges. I mean, for example, let's take plumbing. It can be a challenge snaking plumbing through a floor plate of an office building. And we've been also looking at other forms of housing that exist elsewhere that are not very common here, such as co-housing, where in fact there might be more shared facilities with people with their own units, but maybe shared dining and shared kitchens, for example, and to something that an aging population it seems to increasingly value. And so this idea of, how do we reimagine space that was designed for one use to meet the needs of others, I think is, again, where the opportunity lies. Let's look at schools. Here too, I think students are obviously going back to schools, but I think it's also important that we not sort of forget the lessons of the pandemic and some of the benefits that happened as a result of the pandemic. So, at the height of the pandemic, there were over 1 billion children out of the classroom, which was, an enormous shift and obviously had huge implications for families with children in terms of how one gets one's work done and everything else. But there were also interesting statistics like this, which is there was evidence that many students actually did well in the online world. And apparently, as I've read the literature on this, a lot of it had to do with, although there was a loss of social connection that almost every child missed, and I think would benefit from being back in person learning, they realized that there was a lot of value in the ability of students to sort of work more at their own pace. And this sort of raises a question about the whole way we structure our educational system of moving cohorts of students year after year through a standardized curriculum, when in fact, what happened during the pandemic is that some kids who maybe were really good at math could move more quickly into an area that they were good at and able to work more quickly at, or students who struggled in certain content areas could work more slowly. And so I think one of the things that'll come out of this is the idea of a mass customization of K-12 education, where we're going to, again, be in a hybrid mode where we will still have students back in school, but the industrial model of education that we've had, where every student sits in rows, learns information that they can probably get faster from their cell phone than the teacher can give it to them, and having to work at the same pace of everybody else, no longer makes sense, and I think won't even be tolerated. And so, again, reimagining schools as places where there's greater flexibility in learning. And then also, how do we deal with this, the achievement gap between, high and low income students? I do think, for example, one of the real inequities that the pandemic revealed was the digital inequities of certain households, the lack of access of some students to high bandwidth internet access to digital devices of various kinds. And this was not only a matter of income, but there was also geography in this, which is that there were many rural students who simply did not have the bandwidth that they needed to continue to participate in school. And so I think that one of the things we will see is, just as after the 1918 pandemic, everyone realized the importance of electricity and the effort in the 1930s to electrify America. I think we're going to see in the wake of this pandemic an effort to make sure that there's high bandwidth access to the internet available to every household in the country, regardless of income or location, because of what this pandemic revealed in terms of that digital inequity. So I think we're going to start to see, though, also a kind of reimagining of what school is like, just as we saw schools happening outdoors, as example one on the left. And we're going to see a variety of spaces, more flexible spaces that allow students to learn in different ways. And we're also obviously, I think, going to see a fair amount of homeschooling, that just as I mentioned, that some parents realized their children actually did better studying from home, or some sort of hybrid of these two. And so, again, thinking about the implications that this would have on school buildings, and how we might actually start to think about these building types in distributed ways. In other words, the office isn't just in the office building. The office is both in the office building and at home. The school isn't simply in the school building. The school is also taking place in the home and in other locations. And so start to think about these building types as kind of distributed landscapes of different kinds of spaces that need to be linked together and thought about in new ways, I think is going to be one of the ways in which we kind of reimagine the built environment in the wake of COVID-19. Here, obviously, something that everyone in Nevada is very familiar with, the enormous impact that COVID-19 had on the restaurant and hospitality industry, probably of all of the industries, the one hardest hit. As, by the way, was the case in the 1918 flu. Viral pandemics, do affect any kind of indoor public activity. We've seen across the country lots of restaurants permanently closing and many at risk of closure, and the enormous amount of money that was lost in that industry as a result of that. And the fact that there are still many people who are not yet comfortable returning to restaurants. And again, some of that will change as the pandemic really does leave us, as it eventually will. We may still have COVID-19 as part of our population. It will probably be a permanent part of the sort of spectrum of illnesses that we deal with as we deal with influenza and the common cold and other things. But the pandemic aspect of it and the severity of it should be much better going forward, which may make people feel more comfortable to go into indoor dining facilities. But I also, again, think that there's an opportunity here for the hospitality industry to reimagine itself. Just as I said at the beginning, is that even when people come back to the restaurant, they do now have this option of home delivery, of various kinds of online on-demand options for food. And so it's going to, I think, require that the restaurant and hospitality industry reimagine why come to a restaurant. In my book, I talk about the history of the restaurant, which emerged in France, right just before the French Revolution. And as the name restaurant suggests, the original restaurant was a place to go to be restored. And the nature of a restaurant at the beginning was a place where you would go to connect with people who were your friends, or with people who you wanted to interact with. There was a sense of the restaurant as more of a kind of a clubhouse aspect to it. Of course, we've lost a lot of that. Now we have a kind of sense of, lots of strangers in restaurants who frequently don't know each other. And the food is the one thing that brings them together. And I think we're going to start to see many more entertainment kinds of activities going on in restaurants and curated kinds of experiences. We tend to think of the idea of a curator in a very narrow way as somebody who works in a museum curating objects. The idea of every industry needing to curate their experiences is going to become a dominant issue going forward, because it's the way in which the physical environment is going to compete with the digital environment for people's time and attention. And so thinking about every space that we design in terms of not just the physical components of the space, but what's the curatorial operations of the space? How is the space kind of imagined, and how will it operate, not just functionally, but experientially, is, I think, going to be really important. So again, we're seeing this transformation in dining, where dining is now happening seemingly as much outdoors as it is indoors, and thinking about the landscape as a dining experience and taking over the public realm permanently in many cities for dining opportunities, as well as obviously this idea of a more remote population having food delivered to you. And so again, one of the things that I think is true about pandemics is there isn't kind of a singular effect that they have. They have multiple effects. So for example, we're also seeing a generational shift. We are seeing data that suggests that younger people are continuing to move into cities, and older people and families are increasingly moving out to suburbs or small towns. And while of course that matters a lot depending upon one's work and one's ability to work remotely, what have you, it is showing that there's an acceleration of a trend that was already underway of cities becoming younger and younger. And so again, it's not, there was a lot of prognosis during the pandemic that, cities are going to die. Well, cities have never died after pandemics. They change. They frequently appeal to a different segment of the population for different reasons. And we're seeing that happening now as well. So as just to end that part of my talk, I think there's never been a more important time for the design community than now to take leadership roles. In other words, I think, and one reason I'm giving talks like this to all sorts of folks, I'm giving a talk to a big gathering of mayors on Monday or next week. And, there's a lot of people who don't really know what to do. They know that the world has changed. They know that they can't just go back to the way it was, or if they try to, they're not going to have any employees. And so they realize they have to do things differently, but they don't necessarily know how. And so this is where I think the design community has a role to play, not only in terms of our expertise in the design of physical environments, but in our design thinking methods, our way to imagine what could be and to think about spaces in terms of their experiences, in terms of their relationship to the digital world. So instead of thinking about the digital world as just a bunch of equipment that's sitting inside the physical spaces we design, to realize that the digital world is now, offering their own kind of experiences. It's its own space, and to think about the relationship of digital space to physical space. So for example, I think we are going to see the rapid acceleration into virtual reality, augmented reality, where the very idea of us sitting here looking at screens is going to be viewed as relatively out of date pretty quickly. And so one of the things that's interesting about that is that the digital world and the physical world start to become integrated and kind of continuous. In other words, that we could be in physical space and in a digital space at the same time. And so again, I think that design going forward is going to have to think about this relationship of these two worlds, these two kinds of spaces, and how each can complement and reinforce the other. So again, what are maybe some principles here? And this was based on some research I did with students during the pandemic. Space needs to be much more flexible in the face of so much uncertainty. We simply don't know what all of these impacts are going to be. And so thinking about all of the ways that we may have new technologies, for example, this idea of touchless operation of buildings, I think is going to become a dominant mode, knowing that we've long known that door handles and handrails are some of the easiest ways to transfer disease. And we also have long had the technology that allows doors to open without a handrail, without a push bar or a doorknob, or so thinking about the ways in which we can make environments healthier, smarter, better ventilation, all of these kinds of things. I think, and thinking about space in much more flexible ways, rather than as constantly sort of defining them by a certain set of functions, is to design them in ways that allow them to be very adaptable as the marketplace changes. So another principle, I think, is hybridity. Again, this notion that, and this again is part of our moving beyond a 20th century way of thinking, the kind of form follows function, a way in which modern architecture was envisioned, that assumed that every form had a particular function. Well, we're moving into a world where forms will have multiple functions, depending on the time of day, the day of the week, what have you. And so the ability of space to be incredibly flexible and accommodate hybrid uses, I think, is going to be, again, one of the characteristics. And again, as some of these drawings, I think they're from Woods Bagot in England, but this idea of reimagining domestic space as also a workspace, also a learning space, also a digital space, as well as a residential space, is, I think, going to be just becoming the norm. It is also, by the way, a more sustainable space, a more environmentally friendly space. The fact that we have so much built space that is heated or cooled and unused in our cities is absurd. That buildings sit empty all night or houses sit empty all day, being conditioned with nobody in them, is really an incredible waste of resource. And so the more we can enable spaces to have these multiple functions and allow space to be used as much as possible, as often as possible, day and night across the year, I think is, from an environmental point of view, the more responsible position to take. Again, after every pandemic is a sort of renewed attention to public health. And so there's, for many years, I co-chaired a committee at the AIA and the Design and Health Committee, which was a half built environment people like me and half public health, medical and public health committee members. And we talked about this relationship. And at the time, this was all pre-COVID-19, we were somewhat of an outlier in the AIA. And now that a lot of the work of that committee, I think, is newly relevant as we think about what are the public health implications of the spaces that we create. How can buildings not only not make us ill, but how can they make us healthier? I think is going to be one of the questions that many clients and customers and communities are going to be asking of us. And so we need to have answers. And interestingly enough, as I mentioned, in the 19th century, the emergence of the public health field really had a strong connection to the built environment. Not only John Snow's work with the Broad Street Pump, but also Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect, was the first head of the Sanitary Commission during the Civil War, as there was, in the wake of cholera, a lot more attention to public health. And he actually worked with physicians to basically create what then became the Red Cross. And so here you have a landscape architect at the sort of origin of the Red Cross and paying attention to the role that the landscape, for example, played in keeping people healthy. And so what's happened with COVID-19 is our fields of, those of us who designed the built environment and the public health community, who had sort of drifted apart after that, are now coming back together and having new kinds of conversations about the health of the physical environment. And again, this idea that interior spaces need to be more connected to digital spaces, as I was just saying, that we need to recognize that every space we design has these digital spaces connected to it, a part of it, and increasingly integrated with it. And so again, I think there's a tremendous opportunity for us to sort of embrace those who like to also use the term architect. We're all aware of how digital folks like to call themselves a software architect or a hardware architect. And I think the architectural community understandably bristles at the use of the term, but maybe that's actually telling us something, that in fact, in the future, the architects of the physical space and the architects of the digital space need to get together and work together more closely to reimagine how these two worlds work together. Again, this idea of all interior space is going to probably have a greater range of activities, a greater mix of uses. This was some work that we did in one of my classes where students did research asking people in the midst of the pandemic what it would take to get them to come back to the office. And this diagram is basically what they heard, is that people wanted some private offices because, they still value that. They bought much more co-working space. And because a lot of people recognize that there was the need for collaboration space, and that might be one of the main reasons they go back to an office, a conference room. But interestingly enough, childcare services. And this was a dominant finding of this research is that until we solve the childcare issue and the lack of childcare and affordable childcare in this country, we are not going to have people going back to work or to offices. And so this idea of how do we embed those kinds of services into the workspace, I think is going to be a huge need going forward. All right, well, I'm just going to end here with, going to switch scales, and I'm going to show some slides that are part of the talk I'm going to be giving to the mayors next week. And looking at the urban implications of this, because there are also, as we saw with the previous pandemics, huge impacts on how people live, how we inhabit the landscapes. This is just an image, a kind of randomly taken image off of Google Earth, actually not too far from where I grew up, outside of Cleveland, Ohio, but I picked it simply because it had a range of the kinds of things I wanted to talk about. But as I said earlier, we've built our cities around this assumption that we travel to specialized buildings and districts in order to live, work, shop, and learn. And the fact that the pandemic showed all of us that most of that is not necessary, again, is going to have an enormous impact on these landscapes. And as I said at the beginning, for the first time in human history, the physical world is now in competition with the digital one for virtually everything. And so how will that affect cities, and how will cities compete in this new world? So just as I mentioned that virtual reality, augmented reality will probably transform the experience inside buildings. There's a question of, well, what about the larger scale of the city, and how will this post-pandemic world transform these places? So what I have here is I just look at a set of different aspects of the city. In red, I have some quotes with some interesting data points, and then raise a set of questions. Some of you may be aware of the work that Peter Calthorpe has done out in the Bay Area, where he showed that the Bay Area could accommodate all of the new housing that it needs simply by developing all of the unused and underutilized surface parking lots and commercial corridors in the Bay Area. They had 540 miles of arterials. And his strategy here is, rather than confronting NIMBYism, where you're trying to build denser housing in existing residential areas, is to simply reimagine commercial corridors as mixed-use places where there's retail and other services as well as housing, and to better utilize all of the wasted surface parking that we have in this country. So, again, how do we reimagine these commercial corridors? What are the land use policies that we have in place and parking requirements that make it difficult to do that reimagining? The very idea of single-use zones, that we sort of divide the landscape into commercial zones and residential zones and industrial zones, is probably going to be challenged going forward by the building owners and the property owners themselves, when they discover that in fact they can't sustain kind of the economic activity of that zoning assumes they are, through this kind of singular use. So again, parking requirements, the idea that our 250 million cars have 2 billion parking spots, and that these vehicles sit around parked most of the time. It's on average about 30% of the land in a city is devoted to parking cars, which is, from a tax point of view, a really low use. I mean, typically the tax rate of a surface parking lot is similar to what you tax a cornfield at. It's the very lowest tax rate. And so what are the opportunities for cities to think about higher and better uses, not only because of the shift in commuting patterns and shopping patterns that are going to affect the need for so much parking, the rise of hybrid work, but this other point I raise here about mobility services. Another thing that the COVID-19 pandemic has done has accelerated the automation that has been ongoing now for a while of all work that is dangerous, predictable, or boring. And obviously, this has been a long process. We've long been automating blue collar work or dangerous work. but we are now rapidly automating white collar work, where it turns out artificial intelligence can diagnose a disease in a patient much more accurately than the most experienced physician, for example. And so one of the activities that we all do in a given day that is one of the most boring, predictable, and dangerous things is driving a car. And so my center has been part of a large National Science Foundation research project looking at the rise not only of autonomous vehicles, but the rise of where the car companies are going, which is they are rapidly turning themselves into mobility service companies. And once they do, and as they do that, because it's more profitable for them to be a service company and much less costly for us to pay for mobility when we need it rather than to own and store a car. And so what will happen is the car companies are planning on a future in which they will make cars, they will continue to own the cars, and that we will call the cars up when we need them. And if we need a pickup truck one day, we call up a pickup truck. If we need a van the next day, we call up a van. So we have access to their entire fleet of cars when we need it. And what's important about this is that once they start to own the vehicles, they want a couple things. One, they want them to be electric because electric cars are much easier to maintain and much less costly to operate. And they also plan to keep them moving most of the time. So one of the models that the car industry is thinking about is that these vehicles will move people during the day and goods at night. And all of this means that there'll be many fewer vehicles on the road, and there'll be very little need for parking. And so again, we're going to see a transformation in our transportation system that is going to have enormous impacts on the built environment and our landscapes. So starting to think about that and all of the other things that we can do with this 30% of the land is again, a huge opportunity for the design fields. There's going to, as well, I think, need to be some thinking about about our infrastructure. Of course, we're about to get a big influx of infrastructure money from the federal government, but how should we spend that money? Should we be just widening roads and bridges and highways? Is that the best way to prepare cities for this new economy? What does a post-pandemic infrastructure look like? I would argue we should be spending way more money on high bandwidth access to the internet, on electrification of our transportation system, and actually not widening many roads. In fact, perhaps shrinking roads. It was interesting. I was listening to a Department of Transportation person give a talk yesterday out of Washington. And one of the things that they're now urging all cities to do is to think about the public realm, not only in terms of multimodal transportation, allowing not just cars, but buses and bikes and scooters and pedestrians, but also thinking about the public realm as a power generation zone where there would be solar panels, vertical axis wind turbines, for example. And so the idea of our transportation system also being a power generation system, I think, is something that we might think about in terms of how do we invest in infrastructure that will better prepare us for a future where there will be a very different kind of economy and dealing with issues of climate change and other kinds of equity issues. Residential districts. What is a residential district when half of the small businesses and 2/3 of the economy comes out of people's homes? You know, does it make any sense anymore to talk about them as residential districts? Because they're also production and work districts as well. And so, again, you know, some of this is about questioning these older zoning categories that we have and beginning to apply new kinds of names, as well as to think about every district in a city in hybrid ways, so that the same kind of thinking that I think needs to apply inside buildings needs to apply outside buildings in terms of the larger landscape, and helping local communities realize the value of that greater flexibility, I think, is again one of the opportunities for our fields. Inequities, again, as I've said, you know, the pandemics reveal inequities, and you know, it's certainly been clear from a health point of view the differences in terms of the impact of COVID-19 on communities of color, the lack of access to healthcare on the part of large parts of our population, the fact that we have tended to slip into a two-class economy of essential and remote workers. And despite the name essential workers typically are underpaid for the value of what they do. And so thinking about how we can use this pandemic as an opportunity to really enable all people to participate in this economy and to achieve real affordability with greater flexibility in our zoning policies that allow for a greater variety of ways for people to build wealth. One of the issues I talk about in my classes is that we tend to think of zoning in its kind of current form. The first zoning law was in Los Angeles in 1908. And what was interesting about that is all it did was divide industrial areas from everything else. But what that everything else was, the zoning policy didn't care. In other words, it actually encouraged a mix of residential, commercial activities, and it didn't say anything about minimum lot sizes, minimum unit sizes, minimum setbacks, minimum heights. And I actually think that we need to go back to the roots of zoning and obviously separate out, noxious activities, heavy industry for however much of that still exists in our cities. And create much more flexible policies that do not determine and do not impose all of these limitations that are completely arbitrary on people. What's interesting is I've been studying Japan zoning. Japan actually did that. They essentially have zoning policies very similar to the 1908 Los Angeles Code. And as a result of that, Japan cities have very few homeless people. They have very little affordable housing problems. And they have these cities that are a kind of rich mix of people living in all sorts of ways. In Japan, they don't care if you want to live in 200 square feet in a tiny home, that's your right. If you want to live in the back of your store, that's your right. You have to meet building code safety requirements, but they view that the government shouldn't be telling people how to live. And I actually think that we need to reimagine that in our own cities in the United States and return to where zoning began rather than from what it's become. There'll be new kinds of facilities. This idea of micro co-working spaces in what are currently residential areas is, I think, a new and interesting phenomenon where people who are working at home want to get out of the house sometimes. They need access to technology or childcare or meeting space, but they don't necessarily want to commute downtown to an office. And so we're starting to see what are called neighborhood clubhouses starting to emerge. It's kind of like the digital version of the old corner store, but instead of just accessing goods there, you can access services, technology, and simply be in spaces with other people. So again, thinking about new kinds of building types that will emerge out of this and how we adapt existing buildings for these new functions, I think is an opportunity. Public land, there are 11,000 public golf courses in the United States, and there aren't nearly enough golfers. Although golfing did spike a bit during the pandemic because it was a sport that you could do outdoors, there still is a long-term trend of golf courses struggling financially, and so I think this idea of how are we using this public space that we in the open space that we have, and how can we make it more accessible to a wider range of our populations, I think is going to be, again, something that the pandemic will force, as it did after cholera with Frederick Law Olmsted and the rise of Central Park and of the landscape architecture field, was really as a result of this desire on the part of people in the wake of pandemics to be outside more. And so thinking about better and higher uses for some of our landscapes is important. Office complexes, what are corporate headquarters going to be like in the future as work patterns change, and how might we reimagine an office district to have more of a mix of use? Maybe there's more incubator space. Maybe there's access to the company's equipment by others who are trying to do startups. So how can corporate offices be not these kind of fortresses, but in fact, places that invite in more entrepreneurial activity in part to grow their own businesses. Again, reimagining industrial areas for small business incubators. As I said earlier, small businesses have really suffered during the pandemic. And so I think we need to have very intentional policies related to, small businesses, encouraging that activity, and then looking for space that is appropriate for that kind of incubation. And then reimagining industrial districts. The rise of eco-industrial parks, for example, I think is an interesting phenomenon that, again, seems to have been accelerated because of the pandemic. And to reimagine, as Target did with its big box stores, is to say, maybe these warehouses aren't just warehouses. Maybe they're also places of experience. Maybe again, there's ways in which they're retail and wholesale kind of at the same time, is, I think, again, another opportunity. And then, obviously, as we see climate change increasing, how do we build in resilience? How do we leverage ecosystems and their services to protect cities? And of course, what's going on in Glasgow right now is going to, I think, really force every city to think about its carbon footprint and, how do we decrease that? And so let me just end with this image, which, is just taking this Google Earth image and starting to imagine how cities will evolve in the coming decades. Because again, the built environment is a lagging indicator. It takes a while for leases to get up, for buildings to be built, for zoning policies to change. And so none of this is going to happen quickly, but the pressure to do these kinds of changes is going to happen, is already here. And so beginning to think about, how you can build more housing on, maybe public land so it can be more affordable, more green space, more connected ecosystems, more mixes of uses in single-use zones, greener infrastructure, redeveloping all of the surface parking lots, more walkable neighborhoods. All of these are the kinds of things that I think, again, our professions have an opportunity to take a leadership role with, and to help people see that, in fact, the post-pandemic world can be a much better world. It can be a more sustainable, more equitable, more accessible, less stressful world than the one that we had before. So instead of yearning to go back, I think we should look forward to the opportunities that this pandemic has created for us and seize the day. And so with that, I think I will end. And we have a little more than half an hour. I would love to hear what your questions and thoughts are about all this. And thank you for listening.
Okay, Tom, your camera is frozen, and now that we're going to go into Q&A, do you want to try to get that unfrozen?
Okay, here, let me stop the video. And then I think if I start it up again.
There we go. Perfect. Okay, let's see. I'll go through some of the questions that we've received. Okay, see, with the COVID pandemic, social distancing has encouraged space or spread. This on the urban scale is currently at odds with making progress with climate change issues. One only need to see what happened in cities like Las Vegas, Tucson, Phoenix, Atlanta, Dallas, etc. over the last 40 years, and how the spread has caused incredible inefficiencies of energy use and pollutive contribution. Do you see any way to bring these two apparent divergent concepts, the divergent urbanization versus the consolidated urban environment, closer together?
Yeah, that's a great question. And of course, with all of these, I don't have the answer. I don't have a crystal ball, but I just recently wrote an article for the AIA, part of a research conference, and I called it Living the Low Carbon Life. And so the sprawl that you're talking about in cities clearly has negative environmental impacts. However, at the same time, we're facing a case where, why are we driving to those places? In other words, what the pandemic has allowed us to do is work from home, shop from home, have things delivered to us. And so I think there's going to be a lot of questioning about, why are we getting in our cars and still driving around? And I think what we're going to start to see is many more services being either delivered to us at our doorstep and or available to us in our neighborhoods. And so the emergence of these new kinds of facilities that are starting to be imagined, the neighborhood clubhouse that I mentioned, where instead of you having to drive to your office to get access to some plotter or whatever, some piece of technology you don't have at home, that may be available to you down at the end of your street. I think there's also, for example, as retailers reimagine themselves, they now know pretty much what every neighborhood is buying. And, I mean, you can think of that as Big Brother, but nevertheless, I know this from my colleagues at Target. They pretty much know what anybody is probably going to be ordering and buying. And so one of the things they're envisioning is a future in which there will be autonomous, electrically powered vehicles in neighborhoods with the kinds of goods that people typically need in that neighborhood, where you can get it delivered to your doorstep faster than you can get in a car and go drive and get it. So we're going to start to see a lot of things that have been more centralized to be kind of radically distributed and available on demand at a faster pace than the kind of 20th century way of accessing goods and services. So yes, I mean, sprawl's a problem, but the question is, we're going to be doing much more as we are already at home. And so and also as we electrify our fleet and move to mobility services, that also changes the equation in terms of the environmental impact of moving around. So.
And there's some questions about homeschooling. As more people work, there's some studies that show that students are better learning at home. And as more parents are working from home, do you think that's going to be a move towards more homeschooling and parents being responsible for their education?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's kind of interesting now. I mean, the trend has been with homeschooling that it's younger kids who are homeschooled. And then sometimes when they're in high school age, they typically want to go to the school. But, I think there will be, I think, a greater mix and a greater hybridization, as I mentioned. I think that there is obviously, and there's a lot of research to back this up, there's real value in the socialization skills that come from students being in person together. However, the lesson of the pandemic, as I said, was that some kids, in fact, many kids, do better when they are allowed to move more quickly in parts of the curriculum that they're good at and they have a kind of intelligence for, and able to move more slowly in the areas where they struggle. And there actually now are a lot of ed tech technologies that are very good at helping kids move along at the pace that's right for them. And so I think, it'll not only be that there'll be homeschooling and in-person schooling, but there's going to be a greater a variety of paces in which students are moving through both, whether you're home or at school. And I suspect there's some value in both, being maybe part-time at home and partly at school. And of course, that may depend on the work needs of the family. So, but again, I think that the school itself is going to have to change. The idea of desks all facing forward to a teacher into the front of the room and double loaded corridors of standardized classrooms, all in this industrial model. That was out of date prior to the pandemic. What the pandemic has shown is that is simply no longer acceptable as a learning environment. So again, reimagining schools and their connection into the community, thinking about the entire community, including the home, but the entire community as the classroom, as the school, connecting students more effectively into their neighborhoods. These things have been going on in higher ed, and I think that some of these things are also now going to also trickle down into the K-12 system.
Okay, many municipalities rely heavily on sales tax and property tax revenues. So how is that going to affect things as retail centers and malls are reimagined?
That's right. This is why the mayors are so interested in this topic. They're very concerned about their revenue streams as these changes occur. I mean, a lot of empty office buildings, a lot of empty retail, facilities. is a hit to their bottom line. And so, I think, and this is not my area of expertise, but I do think we're going to have to reimagine how we raise public revenues. I think there's going to have to be a lot of reimagining of the whole economy. I mean, as I mentioned, we can't have a two-tiered economy of essential workers and remote workers, with the essential workers being so underpaid. I mean, as their term says, they're essential. As we learned, if we don't have the essential workers, the economy doesn't function. So I think we're going to have to sort of reimagine the way in which we value work. And a whole other part of my book, which I didn't get into, I'm part of a group here at the university looking at the future of work. And I've been interested in this idea of much work now being automated. And I've been interested in, well, what's left to us? What is the kind of post-pandemic economy? And I call it the sort of 6 or 7 C's. I think of it as, when you look at the research that shows that jobs that are resistant to automation and that people are actually really good at, they're caring jobs, communicating jobs, community jobs, creative jobs, craft jobs, construction jobs, and curation jobs. And what's interesting to me about that those are the nature of the jobs that existed prior to the Industrial Revolution. So one way to think about this pandemic is we're coming out of the back end of the Industrial Revolution. We are turning over to machines or computers now all of the things that they're better at doing than we are. And what we're left with is the pre-industrial economy, in which the things that people are much better than machines at doing, like caring for each other and communicating and creating things, right? Things that, by the way, our field does. We do a lot of these things. We're a creative field. We do a lot of communicating. We do a lot of constructing. So, our fields will actually do really well in this new economy. However, a lot of those jobs are low-paid jobs. We don't pay home health care workers very much. We don't pay childcare workers very much. And yet that's what society needs more of. And so we're going to have to sort of reimagine the economy, as happened after the last 2 pandemics, by the way, and to think about, what do we value as a society and what do we want to reward people to do, as software is increasingly taking over a lot of the things that we're not good at. And so that's a long tangent to answering your question, but I do think that as cities think about their revenue streams, they're going to have to also think about the larger macroeconomic shifts that are going to happen globally, because this was a global pandemic, and sort of reimagine how we support the public realm and the public sector.
Are building codes being studied on how they will more easily address these reimagined uses of building types?
Well, that's a great question. And that's, again, I think a leadership role for our fields. Obviously there are some basic health safety issues, being in a building in terms of egress and, flame threat, all these kind of spread and all these other kinds of issues that aren't going away. But, looking at where there are issues in the code that are based on certain kind of older assumptions, I think is definitely an area of work. I mean, as I said in my talk, zoning is full of that. I mean, there's frankly very little in zoning that is specifically about health and safety. There's some, but there's a lot that's there because of politics. And I think we should have the same kind of lens when we look at building codes. I think there's less politics and more, reason for a lot of the building code requirements, but I think it's time to examine that.
Many drinking fountains have been shut off due to the pandemic. Even water bottle fill-up stations are not allowed. How do you see a shift in design and code for required drinking fountains, or even a design of drinking fountains?
Great question. I've never thought of that question, but it's a really interesting one. Yeah, I mean, how do we share things generally, and how do we ensure that we're not just making each other sick, right? I mean, it's kind of interesting, as I said in my talk, that the fact that we have public water drinking fountains comes out of cholera, right? Where it was what was killing people. Now we have water treatment plants, and we can trust the water coming out of the water fountain. But now there's the issue of other forms of contamination and so I think we're moving into a touchless world. And so, one way to reimagine the drinking fountain is one that operates with no touch. It's interesting, even in mobility services, transportation, a lot of people said, well, what about going into a shared car? This is always a concern with people in taxis or in Uber or Lyft. I'm getting into a vehicle that somebody else was just in. How do I know I'm not going to get it, infected? One of the things the car companies are thinking about, particularly when these vehicles are autonomous, is that between people getting in and the next person getting in, there's a UV blast, that the entire interior of the vehicle has an instantaneous blast of UV, which kills the bacteria and the viruses. And so there may be strategies like this of using technology that can make these kinds of shared pieces of infrastructure safer for people.
Okay, there's two questions that kind of dovetail off each other. There's, ultimately, most developers or building owners will only make changes to their existing buildings that benefit their ROI or improve their bottom line. Do you know of any communities that are already working on incentives to encourage repurposing buildings and examples of what they're doing? And then someone else said that they had heard that in Canada, that some places they're converting buildings into affordable housing. So have you heard of that?
Yeah, I have. Urban Land, the ULI magazine, has been covering some of that. Yeah, it's starting to happen. Again, I think, again, because of the lag time in our fields, I think some of these projects were underway prior to the pandemic. So I'm not aware of things that have gone on because of the pandemic that are starting, but I think a lot of people see, sort of reading the tea leaves and recognizing that, as for example, I mentioned the 50-story office building in downtown Minneapolis, which knows that in another year it's going to be entirely empty. I'm sure that building owner is thinking quite a lot about how he's going to fill 50 floors in a market like this. And so, I think that there's a lot of thinking going on, and there's probably a lot of work. I'm not aware of it yet. But I think we will see going forward these kind of conversions of these office buildings. Interestingly enough, not just the housing is the case. I think I read the article about what's going on in Canada, but also other things. Weirdly enough, urban agriculture. I was in a technology innovation conference a couple of weeks ago, and there's a group in Phoenix that is called Healing the Earth. They've figured out a way to grow food, tons of food, with no soil, indoors, solar powered, with about as much water as 2 households use a year. So we may actually see floors of office buildings becoming urban ag. The fact that there's no soil and very little water actually means that the weight issue is less of a concern. And so, it may not just be housing. We may see all kinds of other sorts of production-like activities going on in former office space.
Okay, traffic has returned to craziness. Delivery vehicles parking in arterial causing issues. Deliveries are coming to homes and apartments multiple times a day. Let's see, so residential districts are now huge and sprawling. Walking paths used by youth are seeing fewer uses. Are we just modifying the automobile culture? How do we address these multiple issues?
Great question. Don't have a simple answer to that. I don't even know if I have an answer to that, but I do. For example, New York City dealing with all of the delivery vans, they regulate them. One of the things I think we're going to see is a regulation of things that we've all become dependent on. We may turn Google into a utility. We may turn Amazon into a utility. In other words, what happened after previous pandemics is we developed water utilities, because we realized that we couldn't have the private sector delivering water alone. It needed to have some sort of regulation from the public sector. After the 1918 flu, we developed electric utilities. And I predict that we will have some new kinds of utilities where there's so many people dependent on these services that you can't totally leave it open to the private sector, because a company can just decide to leave. And, you can't just like tell a city, sorry, we're pulling out and you have no more mobility, or you have no more internet access or whatever. I mean, so I think there's going to be more regulation of the whole distribution economy. Maybe, as I was saying with the mobility service companies, that, packages get delivered at night, and only people during the day. But in terms of what do we do with the 20th century city is a really interesting question. And I don't have an answer to that other than I think it needs to be more hybrid. It needs to be denser. It needs to have a greater variety of activities happening more locally. And we may also see that there may be parts of it that shrink, and parts of it that just disappear. One of the things that I didn't talk about, but in the Black Death, there was a huge shrinkage of cities as so many people died, but also tearing of buildings down that were empty. And so the whole idea of the public park actually emerged in the wake of the Black Death in Europe, with the idea that, in fact, cities, instead of being these incredibly compressed medieval cauldrons of disease, actually needed to have open space in the city because of the demolition of buildings that occurred. And also the rise of the cemetery. That was another innovation that came out of the Black Death. And so we may see parts of the 20th century city simply demolished. There isn't enough market for it. There isn't enough demand. It's too low a density. And so I think we're going to see, again, an acceleration of a trend we were already starting to see, is that cities were trying to develop more walkable and denser parts to them. And I think that will continue, probably accelerate.
A couple questions here that are similar. Do you see a huge gap in who can afford to live in the country and who will be left behind in the city? And then what are your thoughts on how salaries might change or be affected when people move from high density to areas that have lower cost of living?
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. I mean, that's come up as Google and Amazon, but particularly Google employees now are living kind of anywhere. Do you keep your San Francisco salary when you're going to live in rural Idaho? So, or do you pay people differently doing the same job in a company because they have different cost of living? I don't know the answer to that. I suspect every company is going to have to deal with that, because certainly, paying the person living in rural Idaho less to do the same job, that person isn't going to be all that happy when they find out what their colleagues are making. And so, so again, I think we're going to have to sort of see how that plays out. What was the other question? I think I kind of blanked on that one. There was the one about paying people. Oh, you're muted, Stacy.
Okay, it was about the changes in salaries when people move from high density areas to the lower cost of living.
Yeah, that issue. But there was some other part. There was another question that had to do with
about the gap between people who can afford to live in the country and who will be left behind in the city.
Yeah, I mean, the affordability question is an interesting one, and this idea of being left behind in the city is also, I think, an interesting one. Yeah, one reason people are moving to small towns is it's cheaper to live there. However, you do have to have the kind of work that allows you to work remotely, right? And so, and in fact, if anything, I worry the opposite, is that I actually think there's a strong habit, or probably a strong trend, for cities to get more and more expensive, as we're seeing in cities. So if anything, gentrification of the city is to me a bigger challenge than worrying about people who can afford to move to less expensive areas. Because I mean, that's been driving suburbanization in the exurbs for a long time, where people are basically living further and further out because it's what they can afford. However, we also have to make sure we don't have, poor areas that are isolated with no access to transit or no access to the internet. And so I do think that we need to think about regions and think about mechanisms that enable an entire region to thrive. And this is where, I mean, I'm a huge fan of Jane Jacobs, not only because of her writings on urban design, but also because of her economics ideas. And then she argues in books like The Economy of Cities that the modern economy will be one of city-based regions rather than of nation states. That nation states are going to decline in terms of their impact on the economy, and regions are going to be the ones that are going to be competing with each other globally. And I think that that is already true, and it's going to happen even more so after this pandemic. And so every region is going to have to get its act together. I mean, it can't have lots of poverty. Poverty is expensive. It can't have lots of undereducated people who are not very productive. We need to make sure everybody can be as productive as possible if they're going to compete. And so, you know, again, I think that thinking about how the city, suburbs, and rural areas around our cities think in more holistic ways is the way to succeed in this new economy.
One of your questioners also brought up Jane Jacobs. So you
can't lose with Jane.
Right
you can't lose with Jane Jacobs.
Can you speak to the balance of technology, productivity, and the lack of social interaction, isolation, and mental health?
Yeah. I mean, that has probably been, I'm the son of a clinical psychologist. I've all along been interested in the impact of mental health and the built environment's impact on that. Yeah. And I think that that's, you know, one of the great, maybe underappreciated tragedies of this pandemic. We've focused so much on COVID-19 and on vaccines and not thinking enough about the mental health impact of this pandemic of people in terms of isolation and loneliness and lack of social connection. And so, again, I think that we need to do all that we can to help people feel more connected. I mean, I think that, you know, kind of the odd thing, I'm sure you've all found this. I mean, on one hand, we're all physically isolated and have been more and more, and yet we have platforms like Zoom where you can go talk to colleagues anywhere around the world almost anytime you want. And so in a way, you're less connected to people immediately around you and more connected to people all over the globe. And so, you know, but I do think that, you know, dealing with, you know, the problem of isolation and creating more opportunities, you know, and maybe those are reimagining the public realm. I mean, one of the things we've been looking at is what's the street? We just finished a book called Future Streets, and taking streets back from simply being about the movement of cars to being these places where people can interact in new ways. And this is where autonomous vehicle technology is really going to help, which is these vehicles are much safer to be around than drivers. And once you can feel more comfortable being in the public realm and out, you know, adjacent to moving vehicles, you know, how do we reimagine streets as social spaces, as places where people can come together and get to know their neighbors? Because you know, that happened in my neighborhood during the pandemic. Actually, people who didn't know each other were all walking out on the streets because there were no cars and got to know each other. Community gardens started to be popping up in front lawns. And so I think that we have to, again, try to curate social interactions and not just leave it to chance. And I think that'll have, you know, real mental health benefits.
We have a couple questions about indoor air quality. So it says, is ASHRAE working on updating standards for indoor air quality, air exchanges, and similar means to address airborne aerosols? And then also you had discussed plumbing with post-cholera. So what about HVAC changes post-COVID? Have we seen the end of windows that are not operable?
Yeah, well, that's a little beyond my area of expertise. I think ASHRAE is looking at that. Certainly there's been a lot of coverage about, you know, changing ventilation requirements. I don't know the details of that, so I can't really answer that question other than I'm almost certain that our mechanical engineering colleagues and others who are involved in ASHRAE standards are looking into that. And yeah, operable windows. I mean, I got two big ones right here. It could be, although, you know, I don't know if you've been reading about this Dormzilla proposal at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where they want to build this enormous dormitory and none of the students would have windows. So, I mean, you're getting, you know, it's an odd time that we live in, but I do think that we are going to, I think, find that there's going to be a demand for people to have a greater connection to the outdoors, be they physically outdoors or have operable windows, more flexible interiors, more opportunities for, you know, air exchange, more daylight. You know, I teach one of my classes nomadically, and I give my students a choice about where they want to learn. They never pick a classroom, ever. They always pick places where there's comfortable furniture, daylight, often other students around. And so I think that we're going to have to actually engage people in conversations about what kind of environments do you want? Not what do we think you want. And, but, you know, I think if we actually listen, not just to our clients, but the real users of the spaces we design, I think we're going to be surprised. I think a lot of people are not happy with the spaces we've been providing them.
In your discussion of office spaces becoming obsolete, I'm curious of how that shift will alter the strong mentorship and teaching aspect will be impacted in growing our profession's pipeline. How do you envision this shift will change how we grow architects the way we've all become accustomed to over the last century or so?
Yeah, great question. You know, higher ed is an industry that is facing enormous disruption right now. I mean, you know, it's too expensive, it takes too long, it's too disconnected from practice, and it is inequitable. It perpetuates inequality. And so what has happened with the pandemic, it's raised the question of who are your students? I mean, I have my students in my Zoom class, but my Zoom can handle up to 300 students. Why aren't there 300 students, many of whom may be just auditing my class, available and given access? Who are the faculty? I mean, my university could Zoom in any person anywhere in the world to teach this class. Why am I their faculty member? And so, and what's the campus? I mean, I give my students in one of my other classes choice about whether they come in person to my class or stay remote. 2/3 to 3/4 of my students choose to remain remote. And I continue to teach by Zoom, even though I'm in the classroom. And so again, if we give students and the users and the beneficiaries of education choice, they're not choosing to do the things that we expect them to do. And so I think we have to redesign education, in this case, higher education, professional education, in terms of co-designing it with our students, listening to them in terms of how and when and why and what they learn, and reimagine this system to be much more customizable and much more flexible, much more integrated, much more hybrid than what has existed in the past. And schools that do that will thrive. Schools that don't do that are not.
And this kind of dovetails with that. What leadership role can universities play in addressing the transformation into the post-pandemic world?
Well, I guess they need to be talking about these kind of issues and imagining futures. I mean, I think the greatest value that our fields play, apart from all of our technical knowledge about putting up buildings and keeping the rain out, all of that's important. I mean, I don't deny that our fields have an important technical role to play, but our most important role is reimagining possible futures. And that has never been more important at a time when people have no idea what this future is going to be like. And, and also then the fact that the transformation that's occurred in this pandemic between the digital and the physical world is going to force us to ask, why are we doing anything in the physical world? What's the value proposition of building this space or of occupying this space? And that, I think, is also a leadership role. We should be able to say, you know, actually client A or B or C, you should probably do this thing digitally. You don't need a physical space for this. And the physical space, maybe you need much less physical space than what you have. because some of this really is better done remotely. And being willing to do that, being real advisors to clients, not simply that, I'm an architect, so I do buildings. I think we have to move away from that thinking to saying, no, I'm an architect and I'm a creative problem solver for my clients. And the answer may not be a new building, may not be a building at all anymore. And being open to that, I think, is the kind of change that we have to think about in our fields.
Okay, do you anticipate that the current knee-jerk design impacts on the built environment will be programmatically inefficient and costly for end users as the disease is more manageable? Or do you see these trends as the new norm?
I wasn't entirely sure. So knee-jerk reactions.
The design impacts on the built environment right now that might be inefficient or costly for end users. As the disease becomes more, do you see what the changes right now are going to be the new norm, or?
Well, yeah, I don't think we're going to be wearing masks, for a long, on into the future, although it does turn out that it's a pretty effective way not to get the flu and the common cold. But nevertheless, I don't think, some of the things that we're doing, I don't think we'll be enforcing 6-foot separations between people standing in line after the pandemic. So, I think there are some things, and the 1918 flu showed this too. There's some things that we just stopped doing after the pandemic was over, right? However, I do think the touchless operation of buildings is here to stay, because we've known that that's a problem. That's how you get the common cold and flu. We know that we need better ventilation and more air circulation in spaces. We've known that before. The pandemic simply highlighted the impact of that. So there are some things that I do think are going to become permanent. And then there are some things that are really disruptive. This idea that, in fact, having been pushed to several decades into the future by this pandemic, is that the digital world is going to be a much bigger player in all of our decision making. And not only in terms of built space, but it's going to transform how we design. We are very close to an artificial intelligence-based design process in which I'm beginning to talk to my students about the fact that instead of thinking about the designer, somebody has to come up with an idea based on the program and the site and the budget, is that artificial intelligence is going to have all of that in it, and it's going to give us hundreds and hundreds of options. And so the role of the designer is more of an editor, editing back all of the possibilities and being able to make the argument as to why the things that we selected were better than all of the other options. It's a very different mindset than staring at a blank page or a blank screen and having to come up with something. It's about how do you get rid of things? How do you edit back? And that's where artificial intelligence is going to take us. And so, but it also has great advantages. It will have research data embedded into it. We will learn a lot in the process. And so just as we see physicians doing this, watching artificial intelligence do better diagnosis of patients, and then the role of the doctor is more about the communicator, the person who cares about the patient. And so those 6 or 7 C's that I talked about, that's what our role will be as well, is we will be more in the caring role, communicating role, the creative role, but our creativity may be more of an editing role than it is somehow always being expected to come up with something new and original all the time.
We are almost out of time, so I just going to have questions that can kind of help everyone as they're going forward. One, they would like to know when your book is coming out. And then also if you have any additional resources you'd recommend for people to look into for continued information on this topic.
Well, the book, unfortunately, because it's sitting in my computer, but it doesn't come out until early May. That's when Routledge has told me is the pub date. So you're going to have to wait a little bit longer. And other resources, there is an effort underway called Epidemic Urbanism. There's a group there's been a series of webinars looking at the impact of pandemics on cities. And I think they're going to be doing some publications. There's a research conference that the AIA and the ACSA put together that I'm doing a paper for right now that's looked at pandemic effects. So that is happening. But there aren't a lot of resources right now. I mean, I think in part because we're still in the midst of it. But I do think there'll be a lot coming out afterward. I know there's a lot of people writing and thinking about this now. So thanks, everybody.
Okay. I think that's it's 10 o'clock. So thank you, Tom. That was very interesting. A lot of people really enjoyed that. We now have a break until 10:15. So if you can all take your break, and we'll see you back at 10:15 with our next speaker. Thanks.
Good. Thank you. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Break. We're going to go ahead and get started on our second session this morning. So based on last year's post-seminar survey, many attendees said they wanted to learn about modular construction. Today we have